Hi folks, HR Funk here, with a video today that's probably going to generate some unhappy comments, but it's storming outside and it's not safe to be on the range, and this topic has been on my mind the last few days, and I thought this was as good a time as any to delve into it. And what I want to talk about is contextualizing your firearms training when you are evaluating tactics for self-defense. And this came about as a result of a video I saw a few days ago, but it wasn't just that video that caused me to make this video. Rather, it was that I've seen a trend recently, probably for the last several years, truthfully, in firearms training, where there are tactics and techniques that are demonstrated and taught, and people believe they have learned a great new tactic for keeping themselves safe, but they never stop to consider how that tactic might actually apply in an actual defensive situation. Specifically, the video that I was watching was a young man who was demonstrating how to properly find your dot in a red dot optic every time you present it from a holstered position. And it was an impressive video to watch. He was drawing from the IAWB position, actually removing a shirt, drawing, coming up, presenting the pistol, and I could tell from my martial arts experience by watching this individual that he had practiced this over and over and over. And as he was presenting the pistol, it was kind of amazing because his body, other than his arms, was absolutely stationary. His head didn't move, his upper body didn't move, his arms came up and perfectly presented that handgun so the dot was right there every time he came on target, and he was able to get shots on target very, very quickly, and his shooting was very good. But as I was watching it, I thought, this is great for working on a square range. It's probably great for competitive purposes. If the idea is you have to go from a surrender position to accessing your firearm to getting it on target and getting shots on target as quickly as possible to score the highest place possible in the match, then this individual probably does very good. But when we contextualize that into an actual defensive situation, try to envision the circumstances that would be surrounding someone performing that exact thing. That individual, as a defensive shooter, an armed citizen, what have you, is going about their day doing whatever they're doing, and suddenly they're confronted with an imminent lethal threat. Someone is doing something that has caused them to believe they're about to be seriously injured or killed, and they have to resort to their firearm in order to save their life. In that type of a situation, standing absolutely immobile as you're accessing your firearm might be unwise. Probably whatever the individual or individuals are doing that has caused this person to believe they're about to be seriously injured or killed is already taking place as our defensive shooter perceives it. Now, hopefully, situational awareness has been something that is practiced, and they have perceived this threat before maybe incoming bullets are headed their way or a edged weapon is headed their way or whatever. But even so, there's probably going to be some movement. Fights in general and gunfights in particular are not static events. They are dynamic. And the person who is trying to defend themselves in all likelihood is going to be moving, looking for cover, trying to avoid being shot if someone else is presenting a firearm. And the idea of being absolutely stationary and performing that perfect draw that has been practiced over and over and over again, truthfully, what it reminded me of was some martial artists that I've known who have practiced particular techniques in a controlled environment over and over and over, and they are absolutely perfect in their execution of that technique under those controlled circumstances. But when the circumstances change, that particular martial artist might be at an extreme disadvantage from something as random as a sucker punch because it is so different from how they have trained to that point. If our defensive shooter, who has practiced and practiced and practiced this presentation to the point that it is absolutely exquisite in their performance of that technique, all of a sudden now is ducking and moving and maybe coming around cover, all of a sudden the dot is nowhere near where it has been through all those repetitions of training. This, by the way, is why I tend to prefer training to what I'll call match shooting, or sometimes it's called practical shooting, IDPA, all those type of things. And I have no problem with them. If that's something you like doing, more power to you. I wish you all the luck in your future competitions. But again, much like a judo match is a controlled circumstance that is going to favor judo techniques, a shooting match is a controlled circumstance that's going to allow people to employ the skills they've developed in a situation where they don't have to worry about being harmed. When all of a sudden there's a chance of incoming fire or a chance of imminent harm, suddenly a lot of the things that are possible in a match change. And one of those is going to be the idea of that absolute perfect presentation and finding the dot every time, all the time, with no problem whatsoever. And that's just the first of a couple of things I'm going to talk about today with regard to contextualizing your firearms training and your tactics. And the overall purpose behind this video is not to tell anyone not to practice these things or not to train in a certain way. Train, 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 train all the different ways you can. Get as much experience as you can, because if you find yourself in different circumstances than those in which you have trained, but you've trained in a wide variety of circumstances, you still might have a skill set that's going to be applicable in the circumstances in which you find yourself. So I'm not saying don't train, I'm not saying don't practice a certain type of presentation with your handgun that favors finding the dot every single time you do it. But what I'm saying is change up your training so that you're also working in other circumstances where now you're going to be finding the dot while you're looking around cover, when you're firing from a kneeling position, maybe while you're moving. That might be another one. So again, the idea of contextualizing your training means to consider the circumstances in which that tactic or those techniques might be employed, and then try to construct your training so that it will most closely mirror those circumstances, so you're preparing yourself as well as you possibly can. Tactic number 2 that I'll discuss, and by the way, I could go on and on and on about all kinds of tactics and techniques. I'm choosing 3 just to illustrate my overall point in this video, but I could talk about many, many more. But tactic number 2, I see a lot of times when people take video of training courses that they've attended, and I know that this comes probably initially from the military and not too far thereafter from the law enforcement tactical community, and that is where people practice engaging a target while walking toward it. Now, when I was in the Marine Corps, absolutely I could envision circumstances where I might be advancing on an enemy position while firing. In fact, we practiced that. When I was a law enforcement SWAT team member, I could envision circumstances where I might have to advance on a known threat while firing. So in that context, those techniques can be very useful. But when we change the circumstances to an armed citizen, we have someone who has perceived an imminent lethal threat. They have presented a firearm to try to defend themselves from that imminent lethal threat, but then they're going to advance on that threat. What would be the circumstances where that might be applicable? I can think of one, which I'll mention here shortly. But if anything, we would want our defensive shooter either to be moving laterally to avoid incoming fire, maybe at an oblique angle, once again, to avoid incoming fire, or moving to cover, but advancing on that known threat basically makes our defensive shooter an easier and easier target, assuming that they're being threatened with a firearm, or even if they're being threatened with some other type of a weapon, either an edged weapon, a blunt instrument, or what have you, the closer they get, the more likely that the offender can be to employ that weapon against our defensive shooter. So again, I'm not saying don't practice this. The instance I can think of, actually maybe I can think of two, where our defensive shooter, our armed citizen, might have to advance on a known threat. One would potentially be an active shooter situation where our defensive shooter is not the target at that moment, but they are advancing on this known threat to stop that individual from harming and killing other people. Now, when we think about statistically how often that might happen, it is infinitesimal. Possible? Yes. In fact, we kind of saw that with the taqueria incident down in Texas a while back. It was a little different, but that's essentially what our armed citizen did there. So it is within the realm of possibility, but it's going to be extremely rare. And it's important, I think, to consider when and under what circumstances that might be necessary. The other time I can think of where an armed citizen might advance on a known threat doesn't involve another human being, but rather a dangerous animal. And specifically, if that animal is attacking someone else, maybe a child in the yard or what have you, someone might have to advance on that hostile animal in order to stop it from seriously injuring or killing another person. If the animal is coming at our armed citizen, again, I don't think it's a good idea to close that distance. It's probably going to be a better idea to back up or, once again, move laterally, obliquely, or whatever. So again, contextualizing when these tactics might be applicable and how they might be applied, I think is extremely important, rather than just mindlessly rehearsing these drills over and over and over. The last thing I'll talk about, I see not infrequently in the comments section of some of my videos, and it has to do with carrying a spare magazine. Now, once again, I'm not saying don't carry a spare. If that makes you feel more secure, carry as many spare magazines as you want, I don't care. But specifically, I'll have people say, I carry a spare magazine because magazines are known to fail, and if the magazine that I have in my handgun fails, I want to have a second magazine that I can use to replace it. Okay, first off, I cannot think of an instance that I have ever seen, read, or heard about involving an armed citizen where that scenario has played itself out. Now, magazines can fail, and usually you discover that on the range because you'll be shooting and start to have some sort of malfunctions, and you switch to a different magazine and you find out all of a sudden, okay, now my handgun is running fine. Which is why it's important to make sure you test fire your handgun, your carry magazines, and your carry ammunition pretty routinely to make sure everything is still working properly. But let's think about the circumstance where that would play itself out. Once again, we have our armed citizen who perceives a lethal imminent threat and has to resort to a firearm to defend themselves. Now, first off, statistically, that's a very, very unusual circumstance. It does happen, but we've already cut down the entire population to a very small number that actually would find themselves in a circumstance where they have to resort to the use of a firearm for self-defense. Now, our armed citizen actually has to fire the handgun. Just producing it isn't enough to dissuade someone to leave them alone. They actually have to fire in self-defense. And in the adrenaline-charged circumstance of that firing of the weapon, there is a malfunction. Our armed citizen has to have the presence of mind to diagnose the malfunction. They apparently have tried a tap, rack, and bang drill. That hasn't worked, or maybe they didn't, but somehow they have determined that the magazine is the source of the malfunction they're experiencing. They're dropping that magazine, reload. Now, this is all presumably while they're still in danger of that imminent lethal threat, with bullets coming in or what have you. They have, once again, diagnosed the problem, determined it's the magazine, dropped the old magazine, gotten the new magazine in, cycled around into the chamber, and now, still after all that, with whatever amount of time that was required, they are still in imminent lethal danger and they have to continue firing to defend themselves. I, I cannot imagine statistically how small or minute the odds are of someone actually playing out that entire situation. For just the amount of time, either our defensive shooter, unfortunately, is probably going to be seriously injured or potentially killed. The bad guy is going to have lost interest and left because they figured out there are bullets going both ways, or something else will have happened. I just cannot imagine that working itself all the way through that protracted circumstance and then coming to the end where our defensive shooter is still firing in self-defense. Could it happen? Is it possible? Yes. Is it more possible or more likely in a military situation? Absolutely. I could envision that, particularly if you have someone who's used magazines over and over, and I know how magazines are used and abused in the military, and you might have to drop a magazine and get a new one in there. But a military engagement can be, not always, but can be very protracted in terms of the time that it takes. Our armed citizen encounters typically are very, very short in overall time. They don't go on for minutes or hours or whatever. For an armed citizen to have to sustain a firefight for a minute is probably pretty unusual, and for longer than that, it just gets more and more unusual the longer we're talking about. I would say on average, we're talking about seconds, not minutes. So, as I said at the beginning, I'm not saying don't practice these things. I am not saying don't do certain things. I'm not saying don't engage in whatever type of competition you enjoy shooting in. Again, do all those things and then do all the other things you can think of to try to put yourself in as many different circumstances as you can so that you prepare yourself as well as you can should you find yourself in an actual life-threatening situation. In any case, that's the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, if you purchase anything from Optics Planet, be sure to use my discount code, which is... And if you use that discount code, it's good for 7% off your purchase from Optics Planet. And remember House of Pain. You can go to House of Pain Armament or House of Pain Munitions and use my discount code there, which is HRFunk, and that'll save you some money off your purchase from House of Pain. And don't forget the Target sponsor, folks. Go to Target's online, check out their inventory, and see if they have anything that's going to meet your Target needs. See you next time, and until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.